I'm Brianna Keeler, live from CNN's Washington headquarters. Underway right now, President Trump declares a national emergency in an attempt to get billions for a border wall. In a rambling Rose Garden speech, the president turned to past talking points to make his case that a wall is necessary and that he has the authority to redistribute money to pay for it.
I'm going to be signing a national emergency, and it's been signed many times before. It's been signed by other presidents. From 1977 or so, it gave the presidents the power. There's rarely been a problem. They sign it. Nobody cares. I guess they weren't very exciting, but nobody cares. They sign it for far less important things in some cases, in many cases. We're talking about an invasion of our country with drugs, with human traffickers, with all types of criminals and gangs.
White House correspondent Abby Phillip with us now from the North Lawn. So this plan from the president, Abby, calls for a total of $8 billion from, or some of it from the compromise border security bill, only about $1.3 billion there, the rest from other sources. So what are these other sources of about $6.5 billion?
Well, Brianna, as we've been reporting for several weeks now, the White House has been looking around the federal government, trying to identify pots of money that they can use in order to put toward wall funding. Some of this money is going to come from places that are easy for the president to acquire, the smaller pots. For example, about $600 million from the Treasury Department's asset forfeiture program. But then there are larger pots of money, like $3.6 billion from the defense military budget, another $2.5 million from drug interdiction programs that the White House is cobbling together, and they're going to all use all of that money to add to the $1.375 billion that Congress appropriated in order to build the wall. Now, as I mentioned, some of these pots of money might be uncontroversial, but there are going to be some complaints from Democrats and Republicans, particularly when you look at the Defense Department budget that is being siphoned off in order to fund this effort. And the White House says they think that they are on solid legal ground, but you heard President Trump earlier today acknowledging there are going to be lawsuits and there are going to be appeals. He believes they're going to lose some, but ultimately win the broader goal. At the end of the day, what that means is that this process could be held up for many, many months, Brianna.
All right, and Abby, Jim Acosta pushed back against the president's claims about crime along the southern border. Tell us about this exchange.
Well, at the central crux of this is what is the justification that President Trump is using to characterize what's happening at the border as a crisis. He talks about crime, he talks about drugs, but he doesn't give much in the way of statistics. And our own Jim Acosta asked him to show what is his proof, what is his evidence for the claims that he's making.
There's a lot of Department of Homeland Security data out there that shows border crossings at a near record low. That shows undocumented immigrants committing crime at lower levels. That shows undocumented criminals or undocumented immigrants committing crime at lower levels than native-born Americans. What do you say to
you don't really believe that stat? Do you really believe that stat?
What do you say to your critics who say that you are creating a national emergency, that you're concocting a national emergency here in order to get your wall because you couldn't get it through other ways?
What do you think? Do you think I'm creating something? Ask these incredible women who lost their daughters and their sons, okay? Because your question is a very political question.
And so President Trump there is disputing the premise of the statistics that Jim cited, which come from the Trump administration, but he didn't provide his own. And I would note on the last point that he made about the prison population, he's talking about federal prisons, which only account for about 10% of all crimes that are committed in this country. So there's a real big gap between President Trump's claims and what we actually know about what's happening in terms of crime and drugs in this country, Brianna.
There sure is. Abby Phillip, thank you. Now, opponents of this emergency declaration inside the halls of Congress, outside the halls of Congress, they're at work right now, strategizing on legal options. That's something that President Trump obviously has already anticipated.
We will have a national emergency, and we will then be sued, and they will sue us in the Ninth Circuit, even though it shouldn't be there. and we will possibly get a bad ruling, and then we'll get another bad ruling, and then we'll end up in the Supreme Court, and hopefully we'll get a fair shake.
Former federal prosecutor Kim Whaley with us. We have A.B. Stoddard, Real Clear Politics associate editor. We have Nancy Cook, Politico's White House reporter, and CNN senior political reporter Nia Malika Henderson with us. All right, let's start with the legal challenges, Kim, because he's expecting them. There's no doubt they're going to happen, but he says, like the travel ban, I'm going to get a victory when it goes to the Supreme Court.
I think that's going to be a really tough win for him, honestly, because as has been reported, the question here has to do with the appropriations clause of the United States Constitution. We have a Congress that did not appropriate this money. He's going around that process using a statute to declare a national emergency. The argument is going to be that's inconsistent with the plain language of the Constitution, which has Congress decide how to spend that kind of money. If Congress is not on board, the president has to do something different. Now, he declared something a national emergency. The statute does not define the word emergency. So I think that's going to be a question that a court would take into account. If the court even takes the case, there's a possibility a court could say, listen, this is a political question. I'm not going to take it. But under President Truman, there's a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube, in which the court said that taking over steel mills to help with the Korean War to make sure we had enough steel.
During a strike, essentially,
During a
right?
strike, exactly. That was unconstitutional. So I think it's going to be really tough, even with this Supreme Court, to get around Youngstown Sheet and Tube.
And, Charlie Dent, Republican, former congressman who was an appropriator, said on our air not too long ago, AB, that you can't take money for a non-defense purpose and you can't take it for this non-defense purpose when it's supposed to be for a defense purpose. It's just illegal. What do you think?
I listened to Charlie's explanation, and it was very helpful to people who need to understand that the Congress has a constitutionally mandated power of the purse, and that you are responsible for taking care of all these necessary projects around the country, especially when it comes to military construction. These things don't turn around in 7 weeks. They're on a 5-year planning pipeline. You don't just throw a monkey wrench in and start throwing the money around. These have to do with the lives of our troops, and they are necessary. And so the idea that a Republican who's still hanging on in the House, Brianna, that might have won with under 5% in a district that used to be safe, who's looking at the 2020 headwinds and saying, you're going to take the project away that I just funded for my district, for my hardworking constituents, very, very, very tough argument to make with members of Congress.
It's such a good point you make. I mean, let's talk. Military Times actually has a really good sort of bit by bit on the kind of projects that we're talking about, because, yes, there is some of this drug project money from the DOD, but the stuff that would be really easy to get is the construction money. So we're talking a new vehicle maintenance shop in Kuwait at Camp Arifjan, dry dock repairs at Pearl Harbor, hangar improvement at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, ongoing hospital construction at Landstuhl, and new family housing builds in South Korea, Italy, and Wisconsin. And you have seen the state of some of the housing in the military. This is a crisis for a lot of these families. It's hard to imagine, Nancy, that is going to fly. So where does the president go from there with this reality?
Well, the White House has been purposely trying to sort of keep this under wraps, and they were asked explicitly about this on a phone call this morning with reporters. Where will the military money come from? And they sort of dodged the question. But I think that will be a real firestorm for them, because, each of these military projects has constituencies, as AB said, in Congress, who want to be able to say, yes, we're taking care of military housing in Wisconsin. And people, once they realize the detailed plans of that, there will be backlash from both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill.
So is it just a messaging thing then, Nia? Is it just that they don't actually plan on getting to the point where they're dealing with what would be hugely unpopular issues that would obviously come out covered by the media? Are they assuming this gets hung up and really this is just appears like President Trump is doing something?
Ways, I mean, you heard the president there in that sort of sing-songy voice go through what he thought was going to happen in terms of the courts. I think there is a perspective here that the president just wants this fight. He wants to be caught trying, as Bill Clinton would say, caught trying to get this wall and going around Congress, going around Democrats who he sees as obstructionists. And if he can keep that fight going, this idea of not build the wall right now, he at least is saying it's finish the wall, and he's going to be fighting in the courts. He's going to be fighting Democrats. He's going to be fighting in some ways probably recalcitrant Republicans. Republicans as well. And that's what we know about this president. That's the stance he always likes to fight, particularly on this core issue of immigration and building the wall.
He said something that was key where he says, I want to play this. He says that it would have been easier if we did this sooner. Can we play that?
Would have been great to have done it earlier, but I was a little new to the job, a little new to the profession. And we had a little disappointment for the first year and a half. People that should have stepped up did not step up. They didn't step up, and they should have. Would have been easy. Not that easy, but it would have been a lot easier. But some people didn't step up. But we're stepping up now.
All right, paging Paul Ryan.
Right, testing him.
We know who he's talking about. What do you think?
I think that's right. He's trying to pin the blame on Paul Ryan. This, again, is what the president often does. The buck never stops with the president. It stops somewhere else. In this case, Paul Ryan. I mean, the president promised a free wall, right? I mean, that was the idea, that through his masterful negotiating skills, he could bend the Mexican president to his will or somehow get it through remittances or something like that. That never happened. They never really tried to do any of that. And the fact is that Republicans didn't necessarily support this wall, which is why it's taken so long and why at this point he's having to make this end run around Congress to get the more $1 billion that Congress wouldn't give him.
Did he say anything that was problematic to his case, AB?
Yes, he said it so many different ways. He said this is about 2020. He said I didn't have to do this. He said I'm doing it because Congress isn't working fast enough. He called it a non-emergency, a fake emergency in so many ways, multiple times, infuriating the lawyers he's hired to have to defend this, and obviously to the delight of the people on the other side who are going to be working to block it. He really undermined his case. I mean, in many, many different ways, basically saying explicitly this was sort of a political reaction. He said it's not a promise I'm fulfilling, but he said everyone blew it, and obviously Paul Ryan, and so now I have to do this because I don't like the way the Congress is dragging its feet, and this is about the presidential election.
He has a point, though, with Paul Ryan in that under the statute, Congress, the House, can make a determination that this isn't a real emergency. It's fake. And under the statute, that automatically then goes to the Senate. They have to make a determination as to whether they agree with the House or
within
Democratic
less
House.
Than 3 weeks, right? That's what it says.
A Democratic House, they're going to say this is fake. This is not a real emergency. Then it's going to go to the Senate. Mitch McConnell's going to have to rally his caucus to either do an up or down. If it sounds like he might not have the votes for lots of reasons. Number one, because this is a bunch of baloney, really. And if he doesn't, if they don't agree, or if they do agree with the House, then we're going to have to potentially have our first veto.
Even Marco Rubio, he says there is a crisis, and yet he says this is unconstitutional. So we'll see how that flies with the Republicans. You guys stand by for me. Thank you. Nia, Nancy, AB, and Kim Whaley with us. So is declaring a national emergency over the southern border setting a dangerous precedent? Some even in President Trump's party think so. We're going to ask Governor John Kasich what he thinks when he joins us from Ohio next.
Welcome to Atlantis, where This is CNN Breaking News.
Emergency declaration to unlock billions of dollars for a border wall. Earlier, the president explained why he decided to use his executive power.
On the wall, they skimped. So I was successful in that sense, but I want to do it faster. I could do the wall over a longer period of time. I didn't need to do this, but I'd rather do it much faster. And I don't have to do it for the election. I've already done a lot of wall for the election, 2020. And the only reason we're up here talking about this is because of the election.
It is almost a given the Democrats are going to challenge this, but even some members of the president's own party are criticizing his move. We have former Republican governor and former presidential candidate John Kasich with us now. He's also CNN's senior political commentator. What do you think about this use of executive power?
Well, Breanna, I used to be a congressman, too, and so I was involved in a lot of negotiations and a lot of issues. So here you have Republicans and Democrats that get together, they meet behind closed doors, they put in countless hours, and they reach an agreement. And they're satisfied and they're happy about it. Then the president says he'll sign it, but, that really isn't very good, and I'm just going to go and do my own thing. So first of all, it creates, I believe, bitterness with people who were part of the process. Secondly, Brianna, this is the part we can't miss. I mean, you talk about burning bridges. So they have an agreement to provide some border security and do a whole variety of things, which they hammered out. And then the president says, I don't really care. Now, if you're going to be president of the whole country and care about America, you can't burn every bridge that you have to cross. So we look at the bitterness that's now sowed with the Democrats, and not that they do everything right by any stretch. But when you think about the fact that he's just, it's like, I don't care. And everything seems to be about the base and politics. And what I worry about is the alienation and the bitterness that will remain, the lack of trust, and the inability for both parties to be able to achieve things. And he's brought this on. All he needed to do was to sign this. There were some dollars that were laying around that he could have been able to get without doing this. Now, I did a little research myself and found out that George Bush had declared a national emergency. The Congress was going to pass something to disapprove it, and he dropped it. I'll predict what's going to happen. The disapproval will pass the House. It will pass the Senate. The president will veto it. There will not be the votes to override, but it'll end up in the courts. It'll drag on in the courts. What good are we doing? What is happening here? And I know this isn't part of the discussion, but I just read where they drove Amazon out of New York City, cost them 25,000 jobs. The progressive wing of the party drove the company out. There are 25,000 people who are going to work, and now this is way beyond the pale. We are not operating rationally now in this country, and I'm worried about it. I'm worried about it as an American. That's what I'm concerned about.
Let me ask you about what he said about reallocating some of these funds, because he's talking about some of these are, when you look at the numbers, you're talking military drug interdiction, you're talking military construction. Let's listen.
We had certain funds that are being used at the discretion of generals, at the discretion of the military. Some of them haven't been allocated yet, and some of the generals think that this is more important. I was speaking to a couple of them. They think this is far more important than what they were going to use it for. I said, what were you going to use it for? And I won't go into details, but didn't sound too important to me. Plus, if you think, I've gotten $700 billion for the military in year one. And then last year, $716 billion. And we're rebuilding our military. But we have a lot.
All right, he said, I won't go into details, but it didn't sound so important to me. Okay, so let us go into details then. Potential targets, according to Military Times, new vehicle maintenance shop in Kuwait, dry dock repairs at Pearl Harbor, hangar improvements at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, ongoing hospital construction at Landstuhl, new family housing builds in South Korea, Italy, and Wisconsin. I got
the picture.
When you look at, that's right. You were on the budget. You were the chairman.
I was also on the Armed Services Committee, and I served on the Readiness Subcommittee and was chairman for a short time. But my budget work took me away from that. Yeah, these things are very important. But what this is going to do is, I think the Congress, now I'd be so political, the Congress is going to look at this law. They're going to say whether the president has too much authority. Now, look, I was a governor. I like executive authority. But there's a point at which if you cross, you so infuriate the people you have to work with, you can't get anything done in the future. You know, we got a deficit and a national debt now of $22 trillion. We got to figure out health care. We got to figure out drug prices. We got to figure out infrastructure. If all you're doing is at a war and you burned every bridge that you can possibly burn, how are you going to get anything done? And the mistrust that settles in between the partisans both in Washington and the partisans across the country, this is not healthy. I hate to keep making this statement. Oh, I feel like I've been doing this now for 2 years, but it has to be called out. I do think the Congress is going to review this law, and I think this is a very big mistake.
But these kinds of things that we're talking about, where they're pulling the money from, things that he says that he don't sound too important to him, with your experience on the Armed Services Committee and the budget committees, is that, I mean, this is the stuff that could get jettisoned for what he wants to do?
Yeah, and these things are important. They're really to make sure that our people in uniform can have it a little easier. If you go and check at what their facilities are like, they get run down. There's never enough money for maintenance. And this was a priority for those in the military to make sure that those serving in the military could carry out their responsibilities easier. And there'll be a focus on that. There isn't any question about it. But what this is all about is so deep now. You know, I didn't like what all the Republicans and Democrats agreed to. I'll declare a national emergency. The Republicans in the Senate have said they want nothing to do with it. It sets a dangerous precedent. And it'll be in the courts. Now, I don't know what the courts are going to do. It depends who the judge is. But I have a sneaking suspicion they're going to say this goes too far. In other words, this issue of national emergency has been used in cases like sanctions. It's been used in real national emergencies. And when the intelligence community testifies before the Congress and they list all the things they're concerned about Iran, they're concerned about China, they're concerned about Russia, I never heard them talk about the border. Maybe I ought to be called back up to say, is this a national crisis? Look, it's a serious problem. And the serious problem needs to be resolved not just at the wall, but beyond the wall. And frankly, it's about time for Congress to pass some immigration reform. You see, Brianna, what's happening is everything is melting down. Everything is stuck. And that's not a good place for our country to be.
Indeed. Governor John Kasich, thank you so much for being on from your new studio, I should say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brianna. Here at Otterbein, thank you.
That's right. Democrats on Capitol Hill are ready for a big battle over the president's emergency declaration. They're calling it a power grab. And next, I'll ask Democrat David Cicilline of Rhode Island what he thinks.
In 1 week, a lot will happen in your life.
Congressional Democrats wasted little time blasting the president's national emergency declaration. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer issued a statement saying, quote, the president's unlawful declaration over a crisis that does not exist does great violence to our Constitution and makes America less safe, stealing from urgently needed defense funds for the security of our military and our nation. This is plainly a power grab by a disappointed president who has gone outside the bounds of the law to try to get what he failed to achieve in the constitutional legislative process. We call upon our Republican colleagues to join us to defend the Constitution. Now, just as both parties honored our oath to protect the American people by passing the conference committee bill, the Congress on a bipartisan basis must honor the Constitution by defending our system of checks and balances. The president is not above the law. The Congress cannot let the president shred the Constitution. Democratic Congressman David Cicilline joining us now from Rhode Island. Congressman, when you look at what the president is doing here, and there's also criticism from Republicans, how do you see this playing out? Obviously, the House is going to take action. Do you think the Senate will also register disapproval?
I hope so. Look, it is very clear that there is no national emergency. Illegal border crossings at the southern border are at a 40-year low. The president's own intelligence committee, when they testified before Congress doing their world threat assessment, barely mentioned the southern border and certainly never said it was an emergency. So there's no factual basis for this. The president is really violating his oath of office, violating the separation of powers, taking money or purporting to take money from military construction and counter-narcotics work. So the very things he claims he's worried about, he's taking money from those efforts to fund a wall. And you don't get to use emergency powers simply because you lost at the negotiating table. We live in a democracy. The American people will decide how their tax money is spent, and they decide that by electing members to the House and Senate who appropriate money. The president is not an imperial king who could just issue an edict and overrule the Congress or circumvent the Congress. So I think it's lawless, it's reckless, he's violating his oath of office, and I don't think it'll be sustained in the courts. We're going to take action as Congress to do a resolution of disapproval. I hope our Republican friends will join us because this is really about the rule of law, about separation of powers, about congressional authority, and it's important that Republicans join us in this effort, not just issuing statements, but be certain that they're voting in a way which makes it clear that the president cannot do this on his own.
He's clearly looking at this through a political lens and thinking that this is playing very well with his supporters and some Republicans, that he appears at the very least that he is trying to get this done, that he is trying to build a wall or a barrier. And to that end, whether it does get hung up in Congress, whether he is successful in this, the fact that he is just pushing this message as we look towards 2020, how do Democrats respond to that? Because this is very resonant with many people.
Well, look, there's no question all the president is attempting to do is create some political theater and try to argue that somehow he's fighting for border security and nobody else cares about it. There was a bipartisan bill that helps to secure our border in a really smart way, that makes investments in infrastructure at the ports of entry, in additional personnel, in additional investments that will, provide barriers where appropriate. So there's a good bipartisan compromise. Democrats have been very clear. We are continuing to support investments in border security. We want to do it in a way that actually achieves the objective, that makes sense, that the experts say will actually work, empirical evidence, best practices. And we reached a bipartisan agreement to do it. The president made a campaign promise. This is sort of a bumper sticker. Build a wall, and of course Mexico was going to pay for it. And so we ought not be wasting taxpayer money so the president can fulfill a campaign promise that he promised it was going to be a free wall. But the reality is he's going to keep trying to engage in this public fight. I think we have the responsibility to call him out, and I hope our Republican colleagues will join us, because this is a very dangerous precedent. If every time a president loses a negotiation or doesn't get his or her way, they can just think they can issue an executive order, we will have lost our democracy.
His new bumper sticker is "Finish the Wall," as I'm sure you have noticed. Right. That is what he's saying. And look, that seems to resonate with a lot of people as well. But listen to what he said about your party and its opposition to the wall.
When you look and when you listen to politicians, in particular certain Democrats, they say it all comes through the port of entry. It's wrong. It's wrong. It's just a lie. It's all a lie. They say walls don't work. Walls work 100%.
Okay, when you're talking drugs, maybe not all of it comes through. I think it's only 90%, but that's a lot. How do you respond to that,
the overwhelming amount of drugs come into this country through legal ports of entry. And so if we're serious about doing something about that, we need to make investments so there are cargo inspections and additional personnel so that our ports of entry can prevent drugs from coming into this country. That's where they come. Again, the president keeps throwing out these statements which are not supported by the evidence, not supported by his own Department of Homeland Security or the Customs and Border Patrol. I've been to the border. What the Border Patrol agents tell me, I've been there twice in the last year, is what has changed. It used to be single men coming. Now it's mostly families, often with children that are seeking asylum, fleeing violence and domestic abuse and all kinds of deprivation. We need to respond to that in a humanitarian way, but that's the change of circumstance that's happened at the border. There is not an emergency there. We have invested significantly in reducing the flow of drugs into our country. We want to do it in a way that actually works. The president is fixated on this border wall, this sort of vanity project, a tribute to himself that's not effective, that won't achieve what we're trying to achieve. And I think his own Republican colleagues, by voting for this compromise, made the investments in the things that will actually work.
All right, Congressman David Cicilline, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great weekend. Now, during his announcement, the president made a number of assertions about the situation at the southern border. Tom Foreman is here to fact check a few of them. What are you finding, Tom?
Brianna, we're finding that a great many of these assertions are dubious at best, flat out wrong at worst. One of them that he has repeated many, many times to his supporters in these rallies is that the wall is already being built, and he echoed that theme again today.
We're right now in construction with wall in some of the most important areas, and we have renovated a tremendous amount of wall, making it just as good as new. That's where a lot of the money has been spent on renovation.
The second part of that statement is accurate. There has been a lot of renovation of existing portions of wall or barriers, just as there has been under every single president. But this suggestion that there is construction of something new out there, that is simply not happening. There could be some start on a short section of new wall next month. But the suggestion that it's happening right now, that's not happening. Even he said later on, they're just in reconstruction right now. That's misleading at best. Let's look at another big claim that he has repeated over and over again, that El Paso had a giant crime problem. They built a wall and it stopped.
When the wall went up, was it better? You were there, some of you. It was not only better, it was like 100% better.
El Paso did have a huge problem, a huge spike in violent crime. And then it did drop very dramatically. You can see it right there. Here is the problem, though. All of that happened before the wall was built down in this period of time. And at that point, crime actually went up again. So for him to suggest that the wall is the reason it changed for El Paso in violent crime, that is simply false. One more big claim you have to look at here. You just made reference to it a moment ago. The idea that all this open land with no barrier on it or limited barriers on it is where drugs are pouring into America. He brought that up.
A big majority of the big drugs, the big drug loads, don't go through ports of entry. They can't go through ports of entry. You can't take big loads because you have people. We have some very capable people, the Border Patrol, law enforcement, looking.
Yeah, the problem with that is that very capable people at the DEA have studied this, and they say, look, this is where the drugs are coming in. They're coming in through the legal ports of entry, not through open land. Look at the numbers here on heroin and what they had to say about heroin in this 2018 report. The majority of the flow is through privately owned vehicles entering the United States at legal ports of entry, followed by tractor trailers. You want some proof? Take a look. Here are pictures from the DEA of exactly that happening. In fact, the only drug more likely to be brought into the country through the open land where presumably a fence or barrier would make a difference is marijuana. He has suggested over and over again that that's not the case, that these numbers are somehow wrong. That is flat out false. The bottom line here, Brianna, is that he keeps making these claims, and everything we talked about here has been fact-checked over and over and over again. It was false in the first place. It remains false, and yet the president keeps going back to it.
All right, Tom, thank you for giving us the skinny on all of that. So important. Now, President Trump also spoke of the great support that he gets from Fox News host Sean Hannity and others. But Trump insists he still decides policy. We have Brian Stelter with us next to check on that fact.
I want to keep doing what I love. That's the retirement.
Our story involving an alleged attack on Jussie Smollett, one of the stars on the hit TV show Empire. We're learning that police have made 2 arrests. I want to go to Ryan Young now in Chicago. Tell us what you've learned here.
Well, what we've learned so far is 2 men have been arrested. They haven't been charged with a specific crime just yet. Of course, we've been working our sources to try to detail exactly what happened. But look, this is all very interesting. This story keeps twisting and turning, Brianna. We do know this attack happened about 2 weeks ago. The actor saying he was walking back from a subway late at night when 2 men attacked him, put a rope around his neck, and poured bleach on him. After that, police have been working this case for hours. In fact, the initial detectives worked for almost 24 hours straight. 12 Chicago police detectives have been working this case nonstop to try to figure out exactly what happened. The actor told GMA yesterday that he thought a camera that was nearby would help police, but didn't learn that the camera was turned in a different direction. But then this all started spiraling out of control because we know that police met 2 Nigerian men at the airport yesterday. They brought them in for questioning. They were talking to them for several hours. And then we learned on top of that that the 2 men apparently worked on the set of Empire at one point, maybe even appearing in an episode. So now there's all these questions about the story, whether or not they stick together. Did the 3 men know each other? All these questions have been put out there. Now, detectives and police, for their part, have started getting a lot more quiet over the last few hours because, obviously, with this investigation, you know they've been trying to trace things back. We did also confirm that the police went to the 2 men's apartment. They took several items from inside, computers, cell phones, other things that they want to inventory and go through. And after that, we also learned they used rideshare and cab receipts to figure out the men were in the area. So those 2 persons of interest, they believe they tracked down to those 2 men they met at the airport. Well, how did this all come together? That's the next part. Did the actor have a role in this? These are all the big questions that have been put out there over the last few hours, things that we're trying to confirm through the police department. But as of right now, what we do know is police have made an arrest of 2 men. wanting to confirm the rest of the details is something that we'll be working on the next few hours as police start moving the hands of this investigation a lot faster.
Yeah, it is so bizarre. Ryan Young, thank you for that update. And we have some breaking news. The Supreme Court has decided to take up a case about whether a citizenship question can be added to the 2020 census. We have Supreme Court reporter Ariane DeVogue to tell us more about this.
Brianna, this is a big case. The court has just decided that this term it will decide whether or not a citizenship question can be added to the 2020 census. You remember a lower court said that the administration acted unlawfully when it chose to put that question on for the next census. The administration says we want to do this to comply with the Voting Rights Act, but it was immediately challenged by the ACLU and some states who said that's pretext. That question is being put on there to discourage immigrant families from coming forward. And of course, as you know, this is really important. That census is only comes up every 10 years. It's used for redistricting, for allocating funds. This will be one of the big cases of the term.
And when you look at the makeup of the court, is there any idea of where the court might be on this?
Well, it'll be interesting. One big factor is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been away, right? And we learned that today, for the first time, she was back at the court for this conference. So that means that after she had that surgery for cancer, she missed oral arguments, and now she is back. She's feeling better. We haven't confirmed it, but we think she'll be on the bench next Tuesday when they hear arguments. So that will be a big indicator here. She is the leading liberal on this court, and she'll look hard at this question. As I said, the arguments themselves are going to be at the very end of oral arguments for the term in April. They've managed to put this in. They think it's important to hear it this term because that census has got to be printed by the end of June.
And we will be watching. What a case. All right, Ariane DeVogue, thank you so much. We're going to be right back.
Arby's 2 for $5 Mix and Match has a pairing for every